She was a heap of torn silk in the snow, her hands raw and red against the frost. Inside the palace, music and laughter filled the night. Her cousins were already toasting to her death, their golden goblets raised high, while the woman who owned the very floor they danced upon turned to ice at their gates. They had told her the Duke was a corpse in a shallow grave. They had told her she was a beggar. And then, they had pushed her from a moving carriage into the heart of the blizzard. The cold wasn't just a temperature anymore, it was a thief. It had already stolen the feeling from her legs. It was currently stealing the air from her lungs. 2 degrees. That was all that stood between Eliza Fairley and the long sleep of the forgotten. Then the world changed. The silence of the falling snow was obliterated by the rhythmic, heavy thud of iron-shod boots. It wasn't the sound of a lone traveler. It was the sound of an army. A shadow fell over her, darker than the winter night. Eliza forced her eyes open, her lashes heavy with ice. Standing over her was a mountain of dark steel and wolf fur. Duke Alaric Ravenscroft looked down at the shivering wreck of the woman he had promised to protect, and for a heartbeat, the wind itself seemed to stop in fear of his silence. When he knelt beside her, the heat radiating from his massive frame felt like a physical blow. Eliza gasped, her mind fracturing. She thought he was a hallucination, a cruel trick of a dying brain. She forced her cracked lips to move, her voice a ghost of a whisper. "They told me you died 3 years ago," she breathed, her glazed eyes searching his face. "They told me you left me with nothing." Alaric didn't answer with words. He reached out, his gauntleted hand surprisingly gentle as he cupped her freezing cheek. His thumb brushed over a patch of frost on her skin, and his jaw tightened until the bone looked ready to snap. The rage in his eyes wasn't just fire, it was a god's furnace. He had spent 3 years fighting a war he was never meant to survive, fueled only by the thought of his return to her. And in his absence, the vipers he called family had tried to feed her to the winter. He stripped the heavy, fur-lined mantle from his shoulders and wrapped it around her. The heat hit her like a tidal wave, the scent of cedar and iron filling her senses. With one effortless movement, he lifted her into his arms, pulling her tattered silk body against the unbreakable plate of his chest. He didn't look at the gates. He looked toward the glowing ballroom windows where the celebration continued, oblivious to the storm that had just arrived. "They lied to you, Eliza," he growled, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that promised blood. "I didn't leave you with nothing, I left you with me." He turned back to the line of faceless, armored guards standing behind him. 100 torches flared to life at his silent command, turning the white wasteland into a sea of aggressive orange light. The heat of the flames began to melt the snow at his feet, but it was nothing compared to the heat of the Duke's stare. "Burn the gates," Alaric commanded, his eyes fixed on the palace, "and tell the musicians to stop playing. I want my cousins to hear the exact moment their lives come to an end." He began to march toward the palace, his boots crushing the ice, his grip on Eliza tightening as if he were holding a reclaimed crown. He wasn't just taking her inside to get warm. He was going to turn the palace into a cage, and tonight, the world would finally learn what happens when you try to freeze out a queen. The carriage didn't just slow down, it lurched with a violent, premeditated snap. Eliza's head struck the velvet-lined door, the world spinning into a blur of gold lace and silver fox fur. Across from her sat her cousins, Julian and Clara, their faces illuminated by the flickering carriage lamp like 2 predatory dolls. There was no pity in their eyes, only the cold, clinical look of accountants balancing a ledger. "You really should have died in the fever of 81, Eliza," Julian remarked, his voice as smooth as the brandy he sipped. "It would have been so much more dignified than what happens next." The door was flung open. The winter air rushed in like a physical blow, a wall of sub-zero ice that instantly turned Eliza's breath into a frantic mist. Her thin, gossamer gown, the one Clara had insisted she wear for the festivities, offered no more protection than a spider's web. The lie was the sharpest blade they used. For 3 years, they had fed her a diet of silence and deceit. They told her the Duke had been blown to ash on a distant battlefield. They told her he had left a secret will disinheriting her, disgusted by her weakness. They had stripped her of her name, her jewels, and her hope, turning the rightful mistress of Ravenscroft into a ghost haunting her own halls. "Wait," Eliza gasped, her fingers clutching the carriage seat. Her hands were already turning a sickly, translucent white. "Please, it's a 10-mile walk to the palace gates. I won't survive the hour." Clara leaned forward, a slow, cruel smile spreading across her painted lips. She reached out not to help, but to pry Eliza's fingers away from the cushion. "That's the point, darling. The world needs a tragedy to explain why the Council of Heirs is taking full control tonight. A poor, grieving girl, driven mad by loss, wandering into the Deadlands. It's almost poetic." With a sudden, brutal shove, Julian's polished boot caught Eliza in the center of her chest. She tumbled backward, the world inverted. The scream died in her throat as she hit the snowbank, the impact knocking the very life from her lungs. The snow wasn't soft, it was a bed of frozen needles that tore at her exposed skin. Above her, the carriage door slammed shut with a final, echoing thud. Through the swirling white chaos of the blizzard, Eliza watched the red lanterns of the carriage fade into the distance. She tried to stand, but her silk slippers had no grip on the ice. She crawled, her knees scraping against the frozen crust of the Deadlands, her mind reeling from the betrayal. They weren't just taking her inheritance, they were erasing her existence while the world toasted to their health. Her hands were the first to go. They turned from white to a raw, screaming crimson, the color of a sunset bleeding into the snow. She collapsed, her face inches from the drift, the distant music of the palace ballroom drifting on the wind like a cruel hallucination. They were dancing, they were laughing, and she was becoming part of the landscape. She closed her eyes, ready to let the white silence take her. She believed the lie. She believed Alaric was dead and she was alone. But then the ground began to tremble. It wasn't the wind. It was the rhythmic, metallic thunder of a war march. The air, once freezing, suddenly hissed with the heat of 1,000 aggressive flames. Eliza felt a shadow loom over her, not the shadow of death, but the shadow of a man who had walked through hell to find what was stolen. The heavy, fur-lined mantle that fell over her shivering frame was caked with the salt of the sea and the blood of a front line, but it carried the scent she thought she'd never smell again: cedarwood and cold steel. The cousins thought they had left her in a grave of ice, but they had accidentally lit a fuse. Alaric didn't just look at the palace, he looked through it. His hand stayed on her head, a silent vow that the shivering was over and the burning was about to begin. He didn't just intend to take her home. He intended to dismantle every brick of the life her cousins had built on his grave. The rumors of Duke Alaric's death hadn't just been whispered, they had been celebrated like a holiday. For 3 long years, the world believed the Beast of Ravenscroft was nothing more than bone and ash, scattered across a nameless, mud-soaked trench in the Southern Campaign. The official report, stamped with the seal of the War Office and delivered by a Sommer messenger, said his entire battalion had been wiped out in a single night of fire and steel. The cousins, Julian and Clara, hadn't mourned. They had framed that report in silver and hung it in the gallery. To them, the Duke wasn't a man, he was a massive, steel-clad obstacle that had finally been removed from the path of their greed. They toasted to his ghost while they systematically dismantled the life of the woman he loved. But legends don't stay buried, not when they have a debt of blood to collect. As Alaric carried Eliza's shivering form through the drifts, his dark plate armor clanking like a funeral bell against the howling wind, the reality of his survival felt like a physical weight in the air. He had been a ghost long before he arrived at these palace gates. He had survived the front not by luck or divine intervention, but by a sheer, obsidian will to return to the woman his family had spent a lifetime trying to break. He had crawled through miles of barbed wire and waded through rivers of fire, driven by a single image: Eliza waiting for him at the window of the North Tower. The cousins feared his return for a reason that went far deeper than gold. Alaric Ravenscroft was the only man alive who knew the truth about the Fairley bloodline. He wasn't just her protector, he was the keeper of the secret that made Eliza the true, legal sovereign of the Northern Territories, and Julian nothing more than a common fraud with a borrowed name. For years, Julian and Clara had played a dangerous game, convincing the world that Eliza was a fragile, mentally unstable ward who needed to be kept under lock and key for her own safety. They had used Alaric's death as the final hammer blow to shatter her spirit. "They told me the fire took you," Eliza whispered, her voice cracking like thin ice as the heat of his heavy fur mantle began to thaw the frost in her lungs. She clutched at the silver filigree of his chest plate, her crimson-stained fingers trembling against the cold steel. The contrast was jarring, her delicate, frost-bitten hand against the matte finish of his war-torn armor. "They said you died screaming my name just to make me hate the sound of it." Every night for 1,000 days, Clara would come to my room and tell me how much you suffered because of me. Alaric's grip on her tightened, his gauntlet groaned against the tattered silk of her dress. The cruelty of it was a physical blow to his chest, a psychological torture designed to make her feel abandoned by the only soul who ever truly saw her. They wanted her to believe he had left her to face the wolves alone. They wanted her to feel the weight of a guilt she didn't earn. "The fire took the men I was with, Eliza," Alaric growled, his voice a low, jagged rasp of thunder that seemed to vibrate through the very air. "But it only made me harder. I didn't walk through 300 miles of hell to claim a title I never wanted. I walked through it to reclaim what they stole from you. I walked through it to ensure that the last thing Julian ever sees is the man he thought he killed." In the distance, the palace loomed, a golden cage of light, warmth, and high society lies. For 3 years, Julian and Clara had spent Alaric's gold as if it were water and worn Eliza's dignity like a discarded costume. They had built a kingdom on a grave they never bothered to check, assuming that the dead stayed where they were put. They feared his return because they knew Alaric didn't believe in the polite politics of the Victorian court. He didn't believe in mercy or the soft hand of the law. He believed in scorched earth and absolute justice. Alaric stopped at the edge of the courtyard, the wind whipping his dark fur mantle behind him like the wings of a predatory bird. His wall of faceless guards, the iron sentinels who had followed him back from the front, fanned out in a perfect, lethal semicircle behind him. The orange glow of their torches reflected in the matte steel of his visor and the depths of his eyes, turning his stare into something supernatural. He looked down at Eliza, his thumb brushing away a stray icicle from her brow with a tenderness that contradicted the violence radiating from his stance. She was fragile, she was broken, she was a heap of torn silk and trauma, but she was breathing, and as long as she breathed, the cousins were already dead. They just didn't know it yet. "They think tonight is a celebration of their new era," Alaric said, his gaze shifting to the grand ballroom doors where shadows danced behind frosted glass. The muffled sound of a waltz drifted through the air, a sickening contrast to the deathly silence of the snow. "They think the ghost has stayed in the trenches. They are inside, drinking my vintage wine and planning how to divide your lands while you were left here to become part of the ice." He stepped forward, the snow hissing and melting beneath the heat of the torches, his soldiers moving in a silent, terrifying unison. The Vengeance Gap was closing with every heavy footfall. Inside, there was the smell of perfume, expensive tobacco, and cowardice. Outside, there was only the scent of pine, cold steel, and righteous fury. The Duke shifted Eliza in his arms, ensuring she was shielded from the wind by his massive frame. He was her shield, her sword, and her judge. The cousins had spent 3 years telling her she was nothing. Tonight, Alaric would show them that she was everything. "Let them enjoy their last drink," Alaric promised, the fire in his eyes reflecting the impending slaughter of their reputations and their lives. "Let them toast to the Duke who never came home, because when I walk through those doors, I'm not just bringing back a husband, I'm bringing back a reckoning that will leave this palace in ashes." He looked at the high, arched windows of the ballroom, where Julian was likely standing at the head of the table. Alaric could almost taste the fear that would soon fill that room. He didn't just want them to lose, he wanted them to understand the exact moment their world ended. He wanted them to feel the same cold they had forced upon Eliza, but he would give it to them in a way they could never escape. "Tonight, Eliza," he whispered, his voice softening only for her, "the snow stops falling on you. From this moment on, the storm belongs to us." He raised a single, gauntleted hand, and the iron sentinels drew their blades in a single, terrifying ring of steel. The palace doors, reinforced with oak and iron, looked like paper against the force of nature that was currently marching toward them. The celebration was over. The hunt had begun. The silence of the deadlands was a predator, but it was nothing compared to the shadow that now loomed over Eliza's fadding world. She was a heap of torn silk in the snow, her body so numb she could no longer feel the ice biting into her knees. Her hands, those raw, screaming crimson stains against the white, were the only things that felt real. Inside the palace, the muffled violins played a waltz for her murderers. Her cousins, Julian and Clara, were likely laughing over vintage wine, confident that the blizzard had finished what their betrayal started. They had told her she was alone. They had told her the Duke was a memory buried in a foreign trench. Then the jolt happened. It wasn't the wind. It was the rhythmic, bone-deep thunder of steel striking stone. Eliza forced her eyes open. Her lashes were heavy with frost, her vision a blurred mess of white and grey, but through the haze she saw it, a wall of fire. A dozen aggressive orange torches cut through the dark, their flames licking the freezing air like hungry tongues, and in the center of that fire stood a mountain of dark steel. Duke Alaric Ravenscroft looked less like a man and more like a god of war returned from the underworld. His armor was a matte, charcoal-black steel with silver filigree that caught the orange torchlight, shimmering like liquid fire. A massive wolf fur mantle rested on his broad shoulders, dusted with the fresh snow of 100 miles. His expression was one of pure, unbridled fury, teeth bared in a snarl, his brow furrowed into a mask of righteous rage. This was the man the world had called a ghost. This was the soldier the cousins had said was ash. The vengeance gap was staggering. Inside the palace were the cowards who used carriages and lies to kill. Outside was the warrior who used fire and steel to protect. Eliza! His voice didn't just carry through the storm, it commanded the storm to stop. He dropped to one knee, the weight of his armor causing the frozen ground to crack. When he reached for her, his gauntlets caught the flickering light, casting long, dramatic shadows that seemed to swallow the palace gates behind them. Eliza recoiled instinctively, her mind fractured by 3 years of being told she was a burden. "No," she rasped, her voice a ghost of a sound. "They told me, they said you signed the papers, they said you died wanting me gone." Alaric's hand stopped inches from her face. His eyes, locked onto hers, burned with a heat that could have melted the entire north. The lie hit him like a physical blade. He had spent 1,000 nights in the trenches clutching a locket with her face, fueled by the thought of her safety. To hear that they had used his name to poison her soul was a crime he couldn't just punish, he had to incinerate it. "They lied, Eliza," he growled, his voice a jagged rasp of thunder. "I never signed anything but a vow to return, and I am here to fulfill it." He didn't wait for her to move. He reached out and placed a heavy, protective hand firmly on her head, a symbolic claim of ownership and protection. It was a signal to the faceless, armored guards behind him and to the enemies watching from the windows. She is under my shadow now. With an effortless, dominant surge of power, he lifted her from the snow. Her tattered blue gown hung limp against his dark plate armor. The contrast was visceral, the fragile, broken sovereign held by the force of nature that had come to reclaim her. The heat from his body, trapped beneath the wolf fur, began to seep into her frozen skin, a jarring, painful reminder that she was still alive. He turned his head toward the palace, his eyes fixing on the golden light of the ballroom windows. The laughter inside was about to stop. The music was about to die. "Look at the windows, Eliza," Alaric commanded, his voice vibrating through the steel against her chest. "Look at the warmth they thought they stole from you." Behind him, his guards, a wall of iron sentinels in full sallet helmets, stepped forward in perfect unison. They didn't look like men, they looked like an invasion. The torches they carried turned the courtyard into a furnace of orange light, casting the palace into deep, menacing shadows. "They gave you the ice," Alaric whispered, his grip tightening as he began to march toward the grand entrance. "But I brought the fire, and by dawn, the only thing left of their celebration will be the soot on their faces." He didn't knock, he didn't ask for entry. He walked toward the heavy oak doors with the momentum of a falling mountain, the rhythmic clanking of his boots sounding the countdown to Julian's end. The Duke wasn't just coming home to take his seat at the table. He was coming to break the table, the room, and everyone who had dared to touch what was his. "Steady your heart, Eliza," he promised, the fire in his eyes reflecting the impending destruction. "Because when those doors break, the world is going to remember exactly why they fear the name Ravenscroft." He raised his hand, and the guards leveled their torches like spears. The final outcome was no longer in question. The only thing left was the transformation of a victim into a duchess, and a palace into a tomb for those who had left her in the cold. The heavy oak gates of the palace didn't just open, they groaned under the weight of the Duke's shadow. Eliza lay tucked against Alaric's chest, her body a frail weight of tattered silk and freezing skin. She could hear the frantic rhythm of her own failing heart, but it was being drowned out by something much louder, the synchronized, metallic thunder of a legion. Behind the Duke stood the iron sentinels, a wall of steel that stretched across the courtyard. Their sallet helmets caught the aggressive orange glow of 100 torches, turning them into a faceless army of fire. Alaric looked down at the woman in his arms, his teeth bared in a snarl of righteous fury. Every time her body shuddered against his armor, his rage deepened. He had spent years in the trenches, believing his family was protecting her. He had endured the bayonets and the mud, fueled by the lie that Julian and Clara were keeping his widow safe. Instead, they had used his absence to strip her of her dignity and throw her to the wolves of the Deadlands. "They think they've won," Alaric growled, his voice a low, jagged vibration that Eliza felt deep in her bones. "They think the silence of the snow is their accomplice. They don't realize the storm just came home." He turned his gaze back to his men. The fire in his eyes was more terrifying than the torches they carried. This wasn't a rescue mission, it was a military invasion of his own household. The vengeance gap was closing. Inside, the nobility of the North was sipping champagne and dancing on Eliza's grave. Outside, the man they called a ghost was preparing to burn their world to the ground. "Sentinels," Alaric's command shattered the winter air. 100 blades were drawn in a single, terrifying ring of steel. The sound echoed off the palace walls, a sharp, cold warning to anyone behind those golden windows. The guards didn't speak. They didn't move. They simply waited for the word from the man who had led them through the gates of hell and back. "They told Lady Eliza I was dead," Alaric said, his voice rising with a terrifying, calculated heat. "They told her I abandoned her. They left her to freeze while they toasted to my demise. Tonight, we remind them why the Ravenscroft line is written in iron, not ink." Eliza reached out, her crimson-stained fingers fluttering against the cold, matte finish of his breastplate. "Alaric, the guests, the scandal." "There is no scandal in justice, Eliza," he interrupted, his hand pressing firmly on her head in a gesture of absolute protection. "There is only the reckoning. Tonight, the palace doesn't belong to the Council of Heirs. It belongs to the woman they tried to murder." He looked toward the grand entrance, where the light of the solstice gala spilled out from beneath the doors. He could see the silhouettes of his cousins through the frosted glass, Julian, standing tall with a glass of his vintage wine, Clara, draped in jewels that belonged to Eliza. They were 3 minutes away from signing the decree that would officially erase Eliza's existence. Alaric shifted Eliza in his arms, his grip tightening as he felt the cold still radiating from her blue-tinged skin. The time for shadows was over. "Torches up," he roared. The courtyard ignited as the Legion raised their flames high. The white snow turned a violent, flickering orange. The shadows of the guards stretched long and jagged against the palace walls, like the teeth of a great beast closing in on its prey. The wall of steel began to move, the rhythmic clanking of their boots sounding like the ticking of a clock that had finally run out for the usurpers. "They want a celebration," Alaric whispered, his eyes locked on the doors. "We'll give them one they'll never survive." He didn't signal for a parley, he didn't send a messenger. He marched toward the grand staircase, his heavy boots crushing the ice into dust. Every step was a promise of the violence to come. Every breath he took was a countdown to the moment the music would stop and the screaming would begin. Eliza closed her eyes and leaned into the heat of his wolf fur mantle. For 3 years, she had been a victim of the silence. Now she was the passenger of the storm. "Do you hear that, Julian?" Alaric muttered, his hand reaching for the heavy iron handle of the main doors. "That's the sound of the grave opening, and I've brought enough fire to fill it." He didn't just turn the handle. With a surge of unbridled strength, he kicked the doors with the force of a siege engine. The heavy oak shrieked as the hinges gave way, and the sudden, violent light of the ballroom flooded out to meet the orange fury of the torches. The waltz faltered, the laughter died. The world went still as the Duke of Ravenscroft stepped into the light, a mountain of steel and fur carrying the broken sovereign they thought they had killed. Alaric didn't look at the guests. He looked directly at the head of the table where Julian stood, his glass frozen halfway to his lips. "The music is over," Alaric's voice boomed through the hall, a terrifying promise of the slaughter to come, "and the debt is due." Tonight, the ballroom would become a courtroom, and before the sun rose, Eliza Fairley would be the only one left standing in the ruins of their greed. The heavy oak doors of the Ravenscroft Palace didn't just open, they exploded inward, the iron hinges shrieking as they were torn from the stone. The jolt sent a shockwave through the grand ballroom, instantly killing the music. One moment, the air was filled with the delicate trill of violins and the scent of expensive lilies. The next, it was choked by the sub-zero breath of a blizzard and the acrid smell of burning pitch. Julian stood at the head of the long table, a crystal glass of Eliza's vintage brandy halfway to his lips. Beside him, Clara was laughing, her throat draped in the Fairley emeralds that had been stolen from Eliza's jewelry box only hours before. Their joy didn't just fade, it vanished, replaced by a cold, paralyzing terror as a mountain of dark steel stepped into the golden light. Duke Alaric Ravenscroft stood in the shattered doorway, his silhouette framed by 100 aggressive orange torches. The light caught the silver filigree on his matte black plate armor, making him look like a vengeful spirit forged in the heart of a furnace. He didn't say a word, but the rhythmic clanking of his boots as he stepped onto the polished marble sounded like the ticking of a death clock. In his arms, he carried a heap of torn, pale blue silk. The vengeance gap was on full display for every noble in the room to see. On the raised dais, Julian and Clara were dressed in pristine velvet, their skin warm and flushed with wine. In Alaric's arms, Eliza Fairley was a ghost. Her skin was a translucent, deathly blue. Her hair was matted with ice. And then there were her hands, the raw, screaming crimson of severe frostbite clashing violently against the white fur of Alaric's mantle. "The Duke," someone whispered in the back of the hall, the name spreading like a contagion. "It's the Duke, he's back." Julian's glass shattered on the floor. The sound was like a pistol shot in the sudden silence. "Alaric," he stammered, his face turning the color of ash. We received reports. The War Office said you were fallen. We were just holding a memorial. We were honoring your memory." "You were honoring my grave before you even dug it," Alaric growled. His voice wasn't a man's voice. It was a low, terrifying vibration that rattled the crystal chandeliers overhead. He didn't stop until he reached the center of the ballroom. He stood there, a force of nature in the middle of their artificial paradise. Behind him, the wall of steel marched in. His faceless guards, their sallet helmets gleaming in the torchlight, fanned out to block every exit. They didn't point their weapons. They simply existed, a promise of absolute violence held back by a single thread of Alaric's command. Eliza shifted in his arms, her glazed eyes trying to focus on the cousins who had shoved her into the Deadlands. The sight of Clara wearing her emeralds triggered a flicker of the broken sovereign within her. She didn't have the strength to speak, but she reached out one crimson hand, pointing a trembling finger at the gems around Clara's neck. Alaric saw the gesture, his teeth bared in a snarl that made the nearest guests recoil in horror. "You told her I was dead," Alaric said, his eyes locking onto Julian with the precision of a predator. "You told her I left her with nothing. You took my home, you took my name, and then you took her out to the snow to be slaughtered by the cold." "It was an accident," Clara shrieked, her hand clutching the stolen emeralds. "She wandered out, she was grieving, she lost her mind." "She didn't lose her mind, Clara," Alaric interrupted, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried to every corner of the room. She found me, or rather, the fire found her. He looked down at Eliza, his expression softening for a fraction of a second before hardening into iron once more. He didn't just want them to be afraid, he wanted them to be ruined. He wanted the entire North to see the blood on their hands before he spilled their own. Julian, the Duke commanded, his hand pressing firmly on Eliza's head as a sign of his absolute claim. Get out of my chair. The silence that followed was suffocating. Julian looked at the guards, then at the Duke, then at the terrified faces of the nobility who were already beginning to edge away from him. The lie was dead. The betrayal was exposed. The man they had tried to bury was standing in their house, and he had brought the blizzard inside with him. Alaric stepped toward the dais, the iron sentinels closing the circle around the cousins. The orange light of the torches drowned out the soft glow of the palace lamps, turning the ballroom into a dark, flickering courtroom. Tonight isn't about a will or a decree, Alaric promised, his gaze promising a reckoning that would be told in stories for generations. Tonight is about the debt you owe to the woman in my arms, and since you love the cold so much, I'm going to make sure you never feel warmth again. The waltz was over, and as Alaric reached for the heavy silver collar around Julian's neck, the guests realized that the Duke wasn't just back to reclaim his title. He was back to execute the bloodline that had dared to touch his queen. The heavy silence was broken by the sound of Alaric's boots striking the dais, a rhythmic, metallic thud that sounded like a hammer hitting a coffin lid. He didn't stop at the foot of the stairs. He marched straight to the center of the room, to the high-backed velvet throne where Julian had been sitting moments before. With a single, brutal shove of his armored shoulder, Alaric sent the chair of the acting heir skidding across the marble floor. The guests recoiled, their silks rustling like dry leaves in a storm. They watched in paralyzed awe as the Duke lowered Eliza into the seat of power. She looked like a dying bird. Her skin was a translucent, deathly blue, and her tattered silk gown was soaked through with the melting slush of the Deadlands. Against the deep crimson velvet of the throne, her hands, those raw, screaming red marks of frostbite, looked like a crime scene laid bare for the elite to witness. She was the broken sovereign, a woman who had been treated as trash by the very people now staring at her in horror. Look at her, Alaric's voice boomed, a low, terrifying vibration that seemed to rattle the very foundations of the palace. He didn't just ask them to look, he commanded it. He stood behind the throne, his massive, gauntleted hands resting on the gold-carved wings, his wolf fur mantle draped over Eliza's shivering shoulders like a heavy, protective shadow. He was the force of nature, and she was the eye of his storm. Tonight, you were told she was too unwell to attend, Alaric growled, his eyes locking onto a local baron who had been seen laughing with Julian earlier. You were told she was grieving a dead duke, but the only thing she was grieving was the betrayal of her own blood. Julian tried to speak, his face a mask of sweating, pale desperation. Alaric, please, we thought you were gone. We did what was best for the estate. You did what was best for your greed, Alaric interrupted, his voice dropping to a dangerous, jagged rasp. You told her I died in the fire so you could cast her into the ice. You stripped her of her jewelry, her name, and her dignity. You left her at the gates to be reclaimed by the snow while you toasted to her death with my wine. Behind him, the wall of steel shifted. The iron sentinels moved in a silent, terrifying unison, their sallet helmets gleaming in the orange torchlight. They fanned out, creating a circle of cold steel around the nobility. No one was leaving. The exit was blocked by fire and iron. The vengeance gap was now a physical barrier. Inside the circle were the well-fed, the warm, and the complicit. Outside the circle stood the man who had returned from the grave to judge them. Eliza's glazed eyes drifted to Clara. The cousin was clutching the stolen emeralds at her throat, her chest heaving with a terrified, shallow breath. Eliza's voice was barely a whisper, a ghost of a sound that cut through the room like a razor. The emeralds, Clara, Eliza rasped, her crimson finger pointing toward the jewels. You told me he gave them to you in his will. You said he hated me at the end. The Duke's jaw tightened until the bone looked ready to snap. The lie was the ultimate insult. He had personally commissioned those emeralds for Eliza's wedding day. To hear that they had been used as a tool of psychological torture was the final straw. Alaric stepped forward, leaving the safety of the throne to descend upon Clara. The guests parted like the sea. Every step he took was a promise of violence. "The will you speak of is a forgery," Alaric stated, his voice ringing with a terrifying, calculated heat. "And the man you thought was dead has a very long memory." He reached out, his iron gauntlet closing around the emerald necklace. With a sharp, effortless flick of his wrist, he snapped the silver chain. The emeralds scattered across the floor, bouncing like green drops of blood. Clara let out a strangled cry, falling to her knees, but Alaric didn't even look at her. He looked at the royal physician, who was trembling in the corner. "Doctor," Alaric commanded, his eyes glowing with an unholy fire, "step into the light. You will examine the lady fairly in front of this entire assembly. You will document every inch of frostbite, every bruise, and every mark of neglect." I cannot," the doctor stammered. "The Council of Heirs." "The council is dead," Alaric roared, the sound echoing through the rafters. "There is only me, and if you do not step forward, I will ensure that the next person you examine is yourself." The physician scrambled toward the throne, his hands shaking as he reached for Eliza's raw, red hands. The nobility watched in a morbid, suffocating silence as the truth was literally unmasked in the center of the room. The transition had begun. Eliza wasn't just a victim anymore, she was the evidence. Alaric turned back to Julian, who was backed against the wall, his eyes darting toward the iron sentinels. The Duke didn't need a sword to kill him. His presence alone was a death sentence. "By the time this doctor is finished," Alaric promised, his gaze promising a reckoning that would leave the palace in ruins, "the world will know exactly what you did in the dark. And then, Julian, I'm going to show you exactly what it feels like to be left outside in the snow." The power promise hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. The music was long gone, replaced by the crackle of torches and the terrified whimpering of the guilty. The heavy thud of a silver inkwell hitting the mahogany table was the only sound in the room. It was a jolt that made the gathered nobility jump, but Eliza didn't flinch. She sat on the velvet throne, Alaric's wolf-fur mantle still heavy on her shoulders, its warmth the only thing keeping her soul anchored to her body. Before her lay the decree of attainder, a single sheet of parchment that would strip Julian and Clara of their names, their lands, and their very lives. "Sign it," Julian hissed from the circle of steel guards, his voice cracking with a desperate, pathetic edge. "You're a fairly, Eliza. You don't have the stomach for this. You're a fragile, broken thing. You always have been." The Duke's hand dropped onto Eliza's shoulder, his gauntlet a warm, solid weight that silenced Julian's venom. Alaric leaned down, his breath a hot contrast to the ice still clinging to Eliza's hair. He didn't look at the cousins, he looked only at her. "They told you that your weakness was your nature," Alaric growled, his voice a low vibration that traveled through her spine. "They lied about that too. Your weakness was their invention. Tonight you show them the truth." Eliza looked down at her hands. They were a raw, screaming crimson, the skin tight, weeping and agonizingly tender. To hold a pen would be torture. To move her fingers would be to tear the very flesh the frost had claimed. The vengeance gap was no longer just a concept, it was a physical choice. She could remain the victim they had cast into the snow, or she could become the judge who sent them there. Slowly, painfully, Eliza reached for the quill. The room held its breath. The orange torchlight flickered against the dark steel of the iron sentinels, casting long, jagged shadows across the document. Every movement was a battle. As her fingers closed around the feathered pen, a hiss of pure agony escaped her lips. The crimson of her frostbite smeared against the white quill, staining it with the evidence of their cruelty. "She can't do it," Clara shrieked, her face twisted in a mask of terrified hope. "Look at her, she's dying, she's incompetent. The law won't recognize a signature written in blood." "The law recognizes the survivor," Alaric roared, his eyes flashing with a terrifying, unholy fire. He stepped closer to the table, his shadow swallowing Julian whole. "And she is the only survivor you didn't account for." Eliza didn't look up. She focused everything she had left, every ounce of the broken sovereign that Alaric was breathing back to life, into the tip of that quill. She pressed the nib to the parchment. The pain was a white-hot needle, but she didn't pull away. She dragged the pen across the page. She didn't just sign her name, she carved it. The ink mixed with the raw moisture of her wounds, creating a signature that was a jagged, crimson smear of defiance. Eliza Fairley, Duchess of Ravenscroft. As the final stroke was completed, she let the quill fall. It clattered onto the table, stained red. The silence that followed was absolute. The decree was no longer just a legal document. It was a death warrant signed in the very suffering the cousins had inflicted. Julian collapsed to his knees, his eyes fixed on the blood-stained parchment. The lie was over. The wealth, the palace, the emeralds, it was all gone in a single, painful stroke of a frost-bitten hand. Alaric picked up the document, holding it high for the entire room to see. The force of nature had found his weapon. He turned his gaze toward the iron sentinels, his expression settling into a mask of cold, calculated execution. "The sovereign has spoken," Alaric stated, his voice ringing through the hall like a funeral bell. "The transition of power is complete. Julian and Clara Fairley no longer exist in the eyes of the crown." He stepped off the dais, his boots crushing the scattered emeralds on the floor as he approached his cousins. He didn't draw a sword. He didn't need to. The fire in his eyes told them everything they needed to know about their future. "You loved the Deadlands enough to send her there," Alaric whispered, leaning into Julian's terrified face. "So that is where you will spend the rest of your night. Guards, strip them. If the snow wants a Fairley, it shall have the ones who deserve it." The power promise hung in the air, a chilling guarantee of the retribution to come. The cousins were being dragged toward the shattered doors, toward the very white abyss they had used as a weapon, and for the first time in 3 years, Eliza Fairley felt the warmth of the fire truly reach her heart. The iron-shod base of Alaric's poleaxe slammed into the marble floor, a jolt that silenced the whimpering of the fallen. The echo hadn't even died before Alaric was in motion. He moved like a shadow cast by a furnace, swift and terrifying. He grabbed Julian by the collar of his pristine velvet coat, hoisting the man to his feet with a single, gauntleted hand. Across the room, Clara was being held back by 2 iron sentinels, her face a frantic mask of smudged rouge and mounting horror. "You told the world the Deadlands were a place of tragic accidents," Alaric growled, his voice a jagged rasp of thunder. "You told the neighbors that Eliza simply wandered into the white silence. You said the cold was a merciful end for a broken mind." He dragged Julian toward the shattered palace doors, where the blizzard was still howling, pouring into the ballroom like a ghost. The vengeance gap was now a physical threshold. Behind them lay the warmth of the fire and the remains of a feast. Before them lay the same frozen abyss where Eliza had been left to die. Eliza sat on the throne, her crimson-stained hands clutching the edges of the wolf fur mantle. She watched with wide, glazed eyes as the man she thought was a memory prepared to settle the score. For 3 years, she had been told she was a burden. For 3 years, she had been told that Alaric would have hated her weakness. But as she watched him tower over Julian, she realized that Alaric didn't hate her weakness. He hated the people who had created it. "I am a man of the law," Alaric stated, his eyes locking onto Julian with a predator's focus. "And the law gives you a choice, a mercy you never gave her." He threw Julian toward the open doors. The cousin stumbled, his polished boots slipping on the snow that had begun to accumulate on the marble. "The dungeon is deep, and it is damp," Alaric said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, calculated whisper. "You will spend 30 years in the dark, stripped of your name, eating the bread of a traitor. Or—" He gestured to the pitch-black horizon of the Deadlands. "You can take the same snowy road you gave Eliza. No coats, no horses, just the silk on your backs and the wind in your lungs. If you reach the next outpost, you are free. If you don't—" "Alaric, please," Clara shrieked, her voice cracking as she looked at the thin fabric of her evening gown. "It's suicide. No one can survive that storm without protection." "She did," Alaric roared, the sound echoing through the rafters like a cannon blast. She survived it while believing the man she loved was dead. She survived it with nothing but the clothes you mocked her in. He turned back to Julian, his hand resting on the hilt of his heavy broadsword. The force of nature was done talking. The transition from judge to executioner was complete. The nobility in the room watched in a suffocating, morbid silence as the Duke offered the very thing the cousins had used as a weapon, the cold. Julian looked at the dark, armored line of guards blocking the path to the dungeon. Then he looked at the blizzard. He saw the fire in Alaric's eyes and realized there was no third option. There was no bribe, no lie, and no mercy left in the heart of the man they had betrayed. "The dungeon," Julian whispered, his spirit finally breaking. "Take us to the dungeon." "Wrong choice," Alaric said, his expression settling into a mask of cold, obsidian resolve. He didn't signal the guards to lead them away. Instead, he stepped forward and ripped the velvet coat from Julian's back with a single, violent pull. He turned to Clara and did the same, stripping her of her fur-lined wrap until she stood shivering in the same thin silk that Eliza had worn. The power promise hung in the air, heavy and lethal. Alaric wasn't just sending them to a cell, he was stripping them of their humanity before he buried them in the dark. "You don't get the dungeon until you've felt the frost," Alaric promised, his gaze shifting to the iron sentinels. "Take them to the North Tower cell, remove the windows, let the winter in. I want them to hear the music from the ballroom as they freeze, just as Eliza did." He turned back to the throne, his stance softening only when his eyes met Eliza's. He had broken the usurpers, but the final transformation was yet to come. "They wanted a winter of their own making," Alaric said, reaching out to take Eliza's raw, red hand in his. "Now they shall live in it forever." The cousins were dragged screaming from the hall, their cries lost to the wind, and as the heavy inner doors slammed shut, the guests realized that the Duke's return wasn't just a change in leadership. It was a total, scorched-earth reclamation of everything the North had lost. The golden warmth of the ballroom was finally real, but the jolt that woke Eliza's soul was the sound of the great iron bolts sliding into place, locking the winter out and the traitors away. She sat on the crimson throne, no longer a heap of torn silk, but a figure of terrifying, quiet dignity. The royal physician had finished his work. Her hands were swathed in clean white linen, but the raw, screaming crimson of the frostbite was etched into the memory of every noble still standing in the hall. They looked at her now with a mix of reverence and fear. They didn't see a victim. They saw the woman who had survived the Deadlands to reclaim a crown of ice. Alaric stood at her side, his dark plate armor still caked with the salt of the road and the soot of the torches. He hadn't removed his gauntlets. He hadn't lowered his guard. He remained the force of nature, a towering shadow of steel and wolf fur that shielded her from even the lingering drafts of the palace. "The sun is rising, Eliza," he whispered, his voice no longer a jagged rasp of fury, but a low, steady promise. He reached down and offered his hand. Eliza took it, her bandaged fingers disappearing into his massive iron palm. Together, they walked away from the throne and toward the high balcony of the North Tower. Behind them, the wall of steel remained at attention, their sallet helmets reflecting the first faint light of dawn. The guests watched them go in absolute silence. The vengeance gap had been bridged. The cousins were in the dark, and the sovereigns were stepping into the light. They reached the balcony, and the world below was a transformed kingdom. The white wasteland of the Deadlands was being touched by a pale winter gold. The blizzard had passed, leaving a landscape that was clean, sharp, and silent. From this height, they could see the North Tower cell where the windows had been removed. There was no sound coming from it now. The cousins had learned the price of the cold. Eliza pulled Alaric's heavy mantle tighter around her shoulders. The scent of cedar and steel was her new atmosphere. For 3 years, she had been told she was a ghost in a dead man's house. She had been told Alaric had abandoned her. She had believed the lie because it was easier than hopping. "They wanted me to believe you were Ash," Eliza said, her voice clear and resonant for the first time. She looked at the sunrise, her blue-tinged skin catching the morning glow. "They wanted me to believe I had nothing left to fight for." Alaric turned to her, his expression a mask of obsidian resolve. They underestimated the fire I left in you, Eliza, and they underestimated the lengths I would go to find it again. The transformation was complete. She wasn't the fragile girl who had been shoved from a carriage. She was the sovereign of the North, tempered by the frost and forged by the Duke's return. She looked out over the sprawling estate, the lands that were now hers by right of blood and right of survival. The winter of her life was officially over. "What happens now?" she asked, her eyes finding his. Alaric's gaze moved from the sunrise to the horizon where the rest of the empire lay. The lie of his death had reached further than just this palace. There were others who had conspired with Julian. There were other debts to be collected. "Now," Alaric promised, his hand tightening on the hilt of his sword as the light turned his armor to liquid gold, "we show the rest of the world that the Duke of Ravenscroft has come home, and his Duchess has no intention of being left in the cold again." The power promise hung in the morning air, a lethal guarantee that the reckoning had only just begun. The palace was reclaimed, but the war for their future was a fire that would never go out. The story concludes in the charred remains of the cousins' ambitions, as the wall of steel guards move in. The usurpers are stripped of their stolen finery and cast out into the blizzard without coats, a poetic mirror to the death sentence they once handed Eliza. Standing atop the palace steps, Eliza doesn't flinch or look away. She watches their silhouettes vanish into the white abyss, her hands safely tucked into Alaric's heavy, protective gauntlet. She is no longer a shivering ward or a victim of the ice. She is the sovereign of the North, reclaimed by fire and blood. The narrative reinforces that true power isn't found in a crown, but in the heat of a heart that refuses to stop beating. It serves as a haunting reminder that those who weaponize the environment against the innocent will eventually find the elements turning against them. When justice finally arrives with a torch in hand, it doesn't just provide warmth, it incinerates the lies of the cruel, proving that even the deepest winter cannot freeze a soul destined for the light. If you cheered when Duke Alaric kicked those doors down to reclaim his Duchess, hit the like button and let us know your favorite moment in the comments. Subscribe and hit the notification bell for more tales of high-stakes vengeance and cold-blooded justice. Share this story with a friend who needs a reminder that no matter how cold the world gets, fire is coming.